At 0617 hours Central European Time, the integrated air defense systems protecting NATO headquarters in Brussels detected multiple inbound ballistic missile signatures originating from Turkish territory approximately 2,000 kilometers to the southeast. The detection provided 17 minutes of warning before impact, time sufficient for activation of defensive systems, but insufficient for evacuation of the thousands of NATO personnel working night shifts in the headquarters complex. The missiles were not targeting Brussels alone. Simultaneous launches from Turkish territory were directed at every major NATO military installation across Europe: Ramstein Air Base in Germany, Aviano Air Base in Italy, the Mihail Kogalnicianu Air Base in Romania, the Amari Air Base in Estonia, the Rzeszów Logistics Hub in Poland, and 43 additional NATO facilities spanning from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The weapons employed were Russian-supplied Iskander-M tactical ballistic missiles, the same system Russia has employed in Ukraine and Syria, but deployed from Turkish territory in quantities that intelligence assessments had projected Turkey would never acquire and certainly would never employ against alliance members. The initial salvo consisted of 240 missiles, 30% of Turkey's reported Iskander-M inventory of 800 systems. The salvo represented the largest coordinated ballistic missile attack against NATO territory in the alliance's 75-year history, launched not by Russia, but by NATO's second-largest military in what President Erdogan's televised address characterized as defensive action against alliance plans to expel Turkey and occupy Turkish territory. If this analysis provides strategic clarity about alliance collapse that institutional coverage is characterizing as containable crisis, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Supporting independent analysis means confronting reality regardless of how destabilizing that reality appears. How did Turkey acquire 800 Iskander-M missiles from Russia without triggering the intelligence collection and diplomatic intervention that theoretically monitors weapons transfers between NATO members and adversary nations? What specific failures in NATO crisis management transformed Turkish frustration with alliance constraints into decision to conduct coordinated ballistic missile strikes against alliance infrastructure? How does the destruction of NATO's command and control architecture across Europe eliminate the institutional capability to execute collective defense when the facilities that enable coordination no longer exist? What decision matrix confronts European leadership when the aggressor is formally a NATO member whose expulsion would require unanimous consent from an alliance that no longer possesses the institutional architecture to make collective decisions? What does transatlantic security architecture look like when the alliance created to provide collective defense has been attacked from within by a member whose geographic position and military capability make it impossible to expel or effectively retaliate against? These questions define the analytical framework for understanding not a containable crisis, but a civilizational inflection point where the institutional structures that have organized European security for 3 generations cease to function. The procurement chronology for Turkey's Iskander-M acquisition extends back to the 2019-2020 period when Turkish-Russian defense cooperation expanded beyond the S-400 air defense deal to encompass broader strategic alignment. The Iskander-M negotiations occurred in parallel with Turkey's increasing frustration with NATO constraints on its military operations in Syria and with American support for Kurdish forces that Turkey designates as terrorist organizations. Russian willingness to supply the Iskander-M to a NATO member represented departure from previous export restrictions. Russia had consistently refused to provide the system to any customer outside the former Soviet space because of concern that doing so would enable NATO intelligence collection against the weapon's technical characteristics. Turkey overcame this restriction through commitments that addressed Russian security concerns. The missiles would be deployed exclusively under Turkish operational control without NATO liaison access. The deployment locations would be selected to prevent NATO technical intelligence collection. And operational employment would be coordinated with Russian military command to prevent scenarios where the weapons could be used against Russian interests. These commitments required Turkey to accept operational constraints that fundamentally contradicted its NATO membership obligations. The acceptance signaled Turkish prioritization of strategic autonomy over alliance integration. The financial structure of the Iskander-M deal reflected its strategic character beyond simple arms transfer. The reported cost of $32 billion was financed through a complex arrangement involving Russian acceptance of payment in Turkish lira, Chinese credit facilities, and Turkish commitments to exclude American military equipment from future procurement programs. The deal included technology transfer provisions enabling Turkey to produce Iskander-M missiles domestically under license. After initial deliveries of 800 Russian-manufactured systems, the technology transfer would provide Turkey with indigenous ballistic missile production capability that no NATO member except France and the United Kingdom possesses. The domestic production capability would enable Turkey to sustain and expand its ballistic missile inventory, regardless of future Russian willingness to provide additional systems, creating permanent Turkish capability that no NATO pressure or sanctions regime could eliminate. The diplomatic timeline reveals progressive deterioration in Turkish-NATO relations that Western leadership consistently misread as manageable friction rather than fundamental breakdown in alliance cohesion. Turkish military operations in northern Syria against Kurdish forces in 2019 triggered American sanctions and diplomatic condemnation, but did not prompt NATO institutional response that would have forced Turkey to choose between alliance membership and operational autonomy. Turkish acquisition of S-400 air defense systems in 2019 resulted in Turkish expulsion from the F-35 program, but did not trigger broader alliance sanctions or expulsion proceedings. Turkish maritime disputes with Greece in the eastern Mediterranean in 2020-2022 produced diplomatic crisis, but no institutional consequences that would have constrained Turkish behavior. The pattern established that Turkey could violate alliance norms and pursue policies directly contrary to alliance interests without facing consequences that would fundamentally alter its strategic calculus. The Iskander-M acquisition represented logical extension of this pattern. Turkish leadership concluded that NATO lacked the institutional will to impose consequences that would be severe enough to deter Turkish pursuit of strategic autonomy. The crisis escalation that precipitated the ballistic missile strikes began 72 hours before the attack, when French President Macron publicly advocated for NATO to initiate expulsion proceedings against Turkey based on the Iskander-M deployment and Turkish military cooperation with Russia in Libya and Syria. The French position was supported by Poland, the Baltic states, and the Nordic countries, creating coalition within NATO advocating for Turkish expulsion. German and Italian opposition to expulsion reflected concern about losing Turkish cooperation on migration control and about eliminating NATO access to Turkish bases, but the existence of substantial support for expulsion created perception in Ankara that the alliance was moving toward decision that would force Turkey to either comply with alliance demands or face institutional isolation. Erdogan's government interpreted the expulsion advocacy as prelude to military action. Specifically, Turkish assessment concluded that NATO was preparing to seize control of Incirlik Air Base and other Turkish facilities hosting NATO assets to prevent Turkish interference with their continued operation after expulsion. This assessment, whether accurate or not, became the operational justification for preemptive strikes against NATO infrastructure. At 0600 hours Central European Time, Turkish military command initiated launch sequence for 240 Iskander-M missiles targeting NATO facilities across Europe. The launch was coordinated with Russian military command, which provided early warning data ensuring that Russian air defense systems would not engage Turkish missiles transiting airspace near Russian borders. The missiles followed optimized trajectories calculated to minimize flight time and to complicate defensive intercept. The Iskander-M employs solid fuel, enabling rapid launch without preparation signatures that would provide strategic warning. The missile executes evasive maneuvers during terminal approach that defeat intercept solutions computed during mid-course tracking, and the warhead achieves impact velocity exceeding Mach 6, which provides minimal time for defensive engagement after terminal phase detection. European air defense architecture was not designed to defend against simultaneous ballistic missile attack from NATO territory. Defensive systems are oriented toward threats from Russia to the east. Turkish missiles approached from the southeast along vectors that many defensive installations lacked coverage against. The Brussels strike employed 12 missiles against NATO headquarters. The first 4 missiles struck the main headquarters building at 0634, destroying the operations center, the intelligence fusion facility, and the Supreme Allied Commander Europe's command suite. The remaining 8 missiles struck supporting facilities including communication centers, logistics coordination buildings, and the crisis management facility that would normally coordinate alliance response to exactly this category of attack. By 0642, NATO headquarters existed as burning ruins. The institutional capability to coordinate alliance military operations had been eliminated, thousands of NATO personnel were dead or injured, and the alliance lacked the physical infrastructure required to execute collective defense. Similar destruction occurred at Ramstein, where 18 Iskander-M missiles destroyed the headquarters complex, the Air Operations Center, fuel storage facilities, ammunition depots, and runway infrastructure, eliminating Ramstein's function as the primary logistics hub for American military operations in Europe. Strikes against air bases across Europe followed identical targeting logic, destroying runways, fuel storage, ammunition supplies, and command facilities, leaving the bases as geographic locations rather than operational military assets. The Iskander-M system represents Russian culmination of 50 years of tactical ballistic missile development, beginning with the Scud systems of the Cold War era and progressing through the Toshka and SS-26 Stone to the current Iskander-M, achieving initial operational capability in 2006. The system's technical characteristics make it the most capable tactical ballistic missile currently deployed. The solid fuel propulsion enables launch readiness without the preparation time required by liquid fuel systems. The missile can be fired within minutes of receiving launch orders, compared to hours required for earlier systems. The range of 500 kilometers enables engagement of targets across the depth of European territory from launch positions in Turkey. The flight time to targets in Central Europe is approximately 12 to 14 minutes, providing minimal warning for defensive response or evacuation. The terminal guidance system employs radar and optical seekers that enable precision strikes against specific buildings within larger complexes. The circular error probable is less than 10 meters, meaning the missile will impact within 10 meters of the designated aim 0.90% of the time. The defensive evasion capability distinguishes the Iskander-M from earlier ballistic missiles and from cruise missiles that follow predictable flight paths. The missile executes evasive maneuvers during the terminal approach phase through thrust vector control and aerodynamic control surfaces. The maneuvers occur in the final 30 seconds of flight after the missile has been detected by defensive radars, but before defensive systems can complete engagement sequence. The evasion patterns are not random but calculated based on predicted defensive intercept attempts. The missile's onboard computer analyzes the defensive radar emissions to identify when fire control systems have achieved lock and executes maneuvers designed to break that lock. Patriot PAC-3 systems defending European NATO bases achieved attempted intercept of 47 inbound Iskander-M missiles and successfully destroyed 11, a success rate of 23%. The remaining 36 missiles impacted their intended targets. The low intercept success rate was not the product of defensive system malfunction, but of technical reality that the Iskander-M's evasive capability defeats defensive systems not designed to engage maneuvering ballistic threats. The strategic implications of Turkish employment of Russian-supplied ballistic missiles against NATO targets extend beyond the immediate destruction to fundamental questions about alliance purpose and viability. NATO was created as a collective defense organization to deter Soviet aggression against Western Europe. The foundational premise assumed that members shared common threat perception and common interest in mutual defense. Turkish ballistic missile strikes demonstrate that this premise is false when applied to contemporary alliance. Turkey perceives NATO not as source of security but as constraint on Turkish pursuit of regional objectives and as threat to Turkish sovereignty. The employment of Russian weapons against alliance targets represents alignment of Turkish security interests with Russian interests in opposition to the alliance Turkey formally belongs to. The alignment is not tactical opportunism, but strategic reorientation reflecting Turkish assessment that its long-term interests are better served by cooperation with Russia than by subordination to alliance frameworks that constrain Turkish autonomy. Alliance response capability has been eliminated not just physically through destruction of command facilities, but institutionally through the impossibility of formulating coherent response when the aggressor is a member state. NATO's collective defense provisions under Article 5 envision response to external attack. They do not address scenario where a member attacks other members. The North Atlantic Treaty contains no expulsion mechanism. Members can withdraw voluntarily but cannot be expelled regardless of behavior. The institutional paralysis is complete. The alliance cannot expel Turkey because treaty provisions do not allow it, cannot militarily respond to Turkish attacks because doing so would require collective decision-making through the institutional architecture that Turkey has destroyed, and cannot ignore the attacks because doing so would communicate that alliance members can conduct ballistic missile strikes against each other without consequence. European members individually possess military capability to retaliate against Turkey, but individual response would fracture whatever remains of alliance cohesion by demonstrating that collective defense has been replaced by individual national military action. The geographic realities compound the institutional paralysis. Turkey controls the Turkish Straits, providing the only maritime access between the Mediterranean and Black Seas. Any NATO military operation against Turkey would be conducted without ability to employ naval forces from the Black Sea and without ability to transit reinforcements through Turkish territorial waters. Turkey's land borders with Syria and Iraq provide geographic depth that would complicate any ground operations, and Turkish control of Incirlik Air Base hosting American tactical nuclear weapons creates risk that military operations against Turkey could result in nuclear weapons falling under hostile control. The cumulative effect is that Turkey has achieved position where it can attack alliance members without facing effective military retaliation, because the costs and risks of retaliation exceed any benefit that retaliation could achieve. The precedent implications are catastrophic for alliance credibility globally if a NATO member can conduct ballistic missile strikes destroying alliance headquarters and dozens of military facilities without triggering decisive collective response. The alliance's collective defense commitments are void. Every NATO member on the alliance's eastern flank facing potential Russian aggression must recalculate whether Article 5 guarantees are meaningful when the alliance has demonstrated incapacity to respond even to attacks from within its own membership. Poland and the Baltic states observe that their security depends on alliance credibility deterring Russian military action. That credibility has been eliminated when the alliance cannot even defend its own headquarters from attack by one of its members. The recalculation extends beyond Europe to every American alliance globally. If NATO collective defense commitments are unenforceable, what confidence should Japan or South Korea have in American bilateral defense treaties? What confidence should Taiwan have in American commitments to prevent Chinese aggression? The fires burning in Brussels tonight are not fires of containable crisis requiring diplomatic negotiation and renewed commitment to alliance principles. They are fires of an ending, the ending of the 75-year period during which NATO functioned as effective collective defense organization capable of deterring aggression against member states. What replaces that architecture when the second largest military has attacked the alliance from within, and when the institutional structures that would enable collective response have been physically destroyed, remains uncertain. Can European security be reconstituted through alternative frameworks that acknowledge the NATO era has ended, or will the continent fragment into competing security arrangements as nations pursue individual accommodation with regional powers in absence of credible collective defense? Share your assessment in the comments below. If this analysis delivered clarity about alliance collapse that institutional media cannot acknowledge because doing so contradicts preferred narratives about Western unity and strength, share this video, hit like, and subscribe. The conversation about what European security becomes in the post-NATO environment happens here in this community, not in the alliance bureaucracies that no longer exist as functional institutions. This situation will develop over coming days as European governments attempt to formulate response to Turkish attacks, and as the full scope of casualties and infrastructure damage becomes clear, we will track every development and deliver the analysis that explains what it means for European security, and for the broader question of whether collective defense organizations can survive when members' interests fundamentally diverge. Stay informed, stay sharp. We will see you in the next breakdown.